I am here to talk to you about the Kurds of Iraq. This topic may seem to you as ironic or absurd or poignant given the events over the weekend. But from my perspective, it couldn't be more pertinent. Because what's happened in Kurdistan in the last few days is another painful reminder of what happens when we privilege what is politically expedient today over what is best for everyone over the longer term. The simple fact of the matter is that the Kurds are desperately unhappy as part of Iraq. They've been desperately unhappy. And while it's possible to talk about confederation as one possibility and maybe some kind of enhanced federalism as another possibility, the truth of the matter is the Kurds just demonstrated once again in their latest referendum they want to be independent. They want to be free of Iraq. And this problem is not going to go away until that happens. Now, the events of the last few days have also demonstrated that that ain't going to happen anytime soon. That all the states of the region have determined that they are going to do whatever they can to prevent that from happening. That's a shame, because they're hurt worst of all by this set of circumstances, but they are where they are. And it's going to take some time to create new circumstances in which they might begin to think differently. I want to try to give you something of an argument for why we ought to try to help them to think differently about this. Now, there is a strong moral argument for Kurdish independence. It's very simple. The Kurds are a nation. They are the largest nation on the planet that does not have their own country. They have a separate language, actually multiple languages, separate history, separate culture, etc., and they have been yearning to be free and independent since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. I want to set aside that moral argument, compelling as it may be, and I simply want to talk about cold, hard, strategic politics. Because I think in many ways that is the more compelling case to be made. And it starts with the other side of the argument for national self-determination. The reason that the United States and so many other countries have over the years recognized the importance of backing national liberation movements is because it's very simple. History has demonstrated that when one people are part of a country that they do not want to be a part of, they fight. They fight for economic and political and social rights. They fight for autonomy. And they fight for independence. And those fights, those conflicts, are deeply destabilizing. They can be incredibly bloody. They can suck in neighboring states and lead to greater and greater carnage. And as we think about the Middle East, I don't think I have to make much of a case that that's a part of the world where we should all be looking to see less bloodshed, less carnage, less conflict, less instability. And the Kurds, they've been fighting for their independence from the very beginning. In fact, they've been fighting since before the beginning. Iraq achieved nominal independence from Great Britain in 1932. The first Kurdish revolt against Iraq was in 1931, and they have been fighting ever since. Between 1961 and 1991, the Kurds were in open conflict with Baghdad for 20 of those 30 years. And it only ended because in 1991, the United States finally extended a no-fly zone over northern Iraq, which caused Saddam to back off and give the Kurds de facto independence. And this weekend, we just saw again another example of the Kurdish desire for independence and the conflict that it breeds. Iraq is a place that needs a lot less conflict. It needs to deal with its own problems. And as long as the Kurds are part of it, there is going to be conflict there. Even since the U.S. invasion, on multiple occasions, we have seen the Kurds in Baghdad nearly come to blows. And on a number of occasions, they have had actual firefights in a whole variety of different places. Right? It's not simply going to end because we happen to have a better prime minister in Haider al-Abadi than we did in Nouri al-Maliki. The Kurds want what they want. We can understand it or not, but it is what it is, and it has bred nearly a century of conflict. We should also recognize, though, that the Kurds are not helpful to Iraq. The Kurds are not an asset, they are a liability for Iraq. Especially since the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, at every single juncture, the Kurds have fought as hard as they possibly could to protect their purviews, their prerogatives, their rights within the Iraqi system. Now, this is totally understandable. As I said, for many years they had de facto independence when Saddam was in Baghdad and we were deterring him from moving into Kurdistan. And during that time, they carved out a very nice existence for themselves. And after we invaded and demanded that they come back into the Iraqi political system, the Kurds wanted to do everything that they could to make sure that they did not lose a single iota of the freedoms that they had enjoyed in the prior 12 years, 13 years, however you want to count it. Again, entirely understandable. We all would have done the same. But the problem was, in protecting their own rights and prerogatives, they demanded that all kinds of things be included in the Iraqi constitution, which have made it absolutely unworkable. If you remove the Kurds from Iraq, as we all know, there are some fundamental problems in Iraq, in particular enormous problems between Sunni and Shia Arab, and enormous problems between the central government and other areas of the country, its periphery. Well, the Kurds demanded that the constitution include provisions for the formation of regions, regions which could have their own security forces, regions which could control their own finances, regions which had all of the trappings of states with the exception of full sovereignty. And that went into the constitution because the Kurds demanded it to be part of it. But doing so has now created a will-o'-the-wisp, a siren song for the Sunni Arabs, and for even a number of Shia, who all look at these regions and say, well, if the Kurds can have that, why can't we? It's in the Iraqi constitution, and you now have all of these Sunnis who want their provinces to have the same rights as Kurdistan. And we now have Iraqi Shia down in Basra, where all the oil wealth is, who want the same thing, because their feeling is, we don't want to be under the control of the federal government that's giving away our money, our oil revenues to the rest of the country. Let's become autonomous regions like the Kurds, and we'll do whatever we want to with our oil money. The presence of the Kurds within the Iraqi political system is not just irrelevant, it is actually counterproductive to helping Iraq solve the core political issues that lie at the root of all of its instability and all of the violence that we have seen since 2004. Right? And every time we start moving, or the Iraqis start moving to try to deal with some of the Sunni Shia and some of the center periphery issues, the Kurds step in, understandably, to protect their prerogatives, and they derail the whole train. And so as a result, the Kurds have not been a help to Iraqi strength and security and prosperity. They have been a genuine hindrance. You want to stabilize Iraq? You want an Iraq that isn't constantly in conflict and fighting itself and sucking us into it? We, the United States, we, the world, define it however you want to. Removing the Kurds would be an enormous help, because it's going to be hard enough to solve the differences between Sunni and Shia, to reconcile the problems of periphery and center in Iraq without the Kurds there. You add the Kurds to it and you make it almost impossible. Okay. Ultimately, at the end of the day, this is going to be an issue for a whole variety of countries to decide on. As I said, there's no real prospect of this happening soon. And there are a lot of people who make some smart arguments about why the Kurds shouldn't be independent. Now, there's some dumb arguments as well. Right? The dumb argument is the international legal argument. International law has a massive bias against secessionism. Why? Well, because international law was written by all of the existing states, none of whom want to see any of their subcomponents leave. And as a result, international law is heavily, heavily biased against it. But the United States, Europe, East Asia, we have repeatedly made exceptions to these rules, as we've seen over the years that there are countries, there are nations which deserve their own states, and that to leave them as part of these other groups is simply to court greater disasters. Recently, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, East Timor, Eritrea, and most recently South Sudan have all been allowed to secede from their larger states because the international community recognized that it would be far, far worse for everyone involved to force them to remain under people that they did not remain part of a country that they no longer wanted to be a part of and were fighting to be free of. On the other hand, though, there are people who make the point that right now, Iraqi Kurdistan isn't ready for independence. That if it got independence, it would become at best another corrupt Middle Eastern dictatorship, and at worst, another Middle Eastern failed state. It's a little bit exaggerated, but there's something to it. It's worth pointing out that most states that go independent don't do well at first. The number of states like Norway or the Czech Republic or Canada who sail cleanly into independence, you can pretty much count on two hands. Far more countries are like, the Angolas, the Burmas, the Cambodias, the Djiboutis, the Egypts, the Finlands. Yes, I can go through the entire alphabet to Thailand, Uganda, Vietnam, Yemen, Zimbabwe. Right? All countries and plenty of others which experienced dictatorship, corruption, civil war, foreign intervention in the early decades after they achieved independence. And it's worth pointing out that in every case, the right answer was to support that bid for independence, even though they experienced those problems. Now, in the case of Iraqi Kurdistan, as I said, it's not really an issue. As we've just seen over the weekend, they're not going to be able to go independent anytime soon, right? Whether it's good or bad. But what that does is it does create a window. There is going to be a period of time, probably a fairly lengthy period of time, at least 5 years, probably more like 10 or even 15 years, before the regional politics will change enough to make this possible. During that time, the right answer is not to try to sit on the Kurds, but instead to try to help them fix their own systems. Say to them, in effect, you want independence, we understand that. Deal with your political problems, deal with your corruption, diversify your economy. Under those conditions, the world will be much more supportive for your bid for independence, because we'll understand that we won't be turning loose another potential Middle Eastern failed state. We'll actually be turning loose something that could look better, a new Middle Eastern state that might actually move the whole region in a better direction rather than helping it suck it back down into a worse one. Thank you all very much.